debate is on revolutionary struggle for socialism, and is a debate between Callinicos, from the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party, and Francois Rouleau, who is the British representative of Lute Ouvrier, the French revolutionary organisation. The way in which the debate will take place is that Alex will speak first for 20 minutes, then Francois will speak for 20 minutes, and at the end of that, there are stewards who will be moving around with speaker slips. If you wish to speak in the debate, then obviously you should indicate to the stewards, fill in the speaker slips, and let the stewards have those speaker slips back. But the answer to that. We know that there are a number of comrades from the Ouvrier here, and we will of course urge them to fill in those slips and take full part in the debate. I won't take up any more of your time. I'll introduce Alex Callinicos to begin the debate.
Okay, comrades. Well, the reason for holding this debate is quite simply that Lute Ouvrier and the Socialist Workers' Party are two of the few major far-left organisations in Europe to have survived the downturn in the class struggle over the past 10 years or so, with their forces intact, and in some respects stronger than they were 10 years ago, and moreover to have survived that period without having capitulated to reformism in one variant or another, in the way that very many other far-left organisations have. Now, that's a very important point of common ground between us and LO. But the fact that there is common ground makes it, in many respects, even more important to clarify the extent to which there exists political agreement and political disagreement. Out of that attempt to clarify differences, it is possible to enrich our experiences as revolutionaries in building revolutionary organisations in our different countries. There is, however, a difficulty in debating with the comrades in LO, and the difficulty is quite simply this. As anyone who has read the reply by LO to the article I wrote for the SWP in their international magazine will have seen, reading their reply, LO do not place the same kind of emphasis on revolutionary Marxist theory as we do. I mean, our emphasis on theory is evident in an event of this nature. The general tenor of that reply from the comrades in LO is to play down the significance of revolutionary theory. Now, this attitude, what one might almost call a contempt for Marxist theory, almost, is, I think, related to the actual content of LO's political positions. Because you see, the crucial theoretical difference between LO and the SWP is that LO holds to the orthodox Trotskyist analysis of Russia as a degenerated worker state. In that sense, it's an orthodox Trotskyist organisation. Except that, when it comes to the other so-called socialist states in Eastern Europe, China, Cuba, etc., and here they differ from, for example, the Fourth International, the United Secretariat, people like Ernest Mandel. They see Eastern Europe and so on as bourgeois states. They call them bourgeois states without a bourgeoisie. I don't really understand the formulation, but the general idea is that whereas Russia is some kind of workers' states, the Eastern Europe, etc., is capitalist. Now, I think underlying this position is an important political point. The important political point is that the LO comrades like us insist that only the working class, through a revolution, can establish a workers' state. That you can't have a workers' state created, as in Eastern Europe, by the Red Army, not the working class, or as in China, by a peasant guerrilla army, not by the working class. Only the working class can make a workers' state. That's a very important point of agreement. However, and that's why they refuse to describe states produced by processes other than the workers' revolution as concerned workers' states. So Eastern Europe and China and so on are capitalist. The problem, however, is that as an analysis of the Eastern Bloc, it's hopelessly inconsistent. Hopelessly inconsistent. Because if you look at the social structure the economic dynamics, the political forces at work in Eastern Europe and China, all those are identical in character. Except very minor differences with what happens in Russia. In both cases, in all cases, you have the monopoly of the state of the means of production, a bureaucracy monopolising political power, the working class excluded from the means of production. There's no way in which you can say that Eastern Europe is capitalist and deny that Russia is capitalist. It's a hopelessly inconsistent position. And it's for that reason that in the late 1940s, when the Fourth International generally had the kind of position that LO has, that our tradition, the tradition of the SWP, was founded by Tony Cliff developing the theory of state capitalism, which showed that all these societies were a form of capitalism. And in that way, both preserve the link between Marxism and the working class. Only the working class can create a worker state, but provided an insight into the dynamics of those societies, which is very, very important even today. Now, the problem with the LO position is that once you have a theory which is so manifestly inconsistent, you can't really take theory seriously anymore. You have to immunise theory from reality. You have to treat theory as a set of dogmas that you keep in the cupboard, that you like to have around in the background, but that you don't use seriously to explore the nature of the world in which we live. Now, the other comrades say, in not a terribly polite way, in their reply to the article I wrote, that the alternative that we in the SWP represent is academicism, and there are various cracks about philosophers, which I couldn't help taking personally. However, you see, why was it that people like Marx and Engels and Lenin and Gramsci and Luxemburg and Trotsky devoted such enormous time to developing Marxist theory? Why did Marx spend his best years working on capital? Why did Lenin, at the time of the First World War, go off and read Hegel's Science of Logic? Why have the great revolutionary Marxists devoted such attention to theory? For the very simple reason, as Engels put it, that I think it was Engels, that Marxism as a theory is necessarily a guide to action. The importance of theory, of clarifying theory, of developing theory, is the better to understand the world in which we live, more concretely to plot the changes that take place in the capitalist economy and the shifts in the level of the class struggle that take place. Now, why does it matter so much to understand the state of the capitalist economy and shifts in the class struggle, both in individual countries and on a world scale? It matters so much because the scope for revolutionary intervention, the ability that revolutionaries have to build their organisations and to intervene and influence and ultimately lead workers' struggles, depends in part, not wholly, but in part on the nature of the objective situation. Now, one of the things that made me most sad about the LO comrades' reply was the extent to which they really denied that. That they poured scorn on our criticisms of Trotsky, essentially based on the fact that he predicted a world slump and a revolutionary crisis at the end of the Second World War, and instead there was a 25-year coup. This was to reduce Trotsky to a prophet, to Nostradamus, and or various other polite things like that. Now, I think that this is frankly an absurd position, because it seems to me quite simply absurd to say that it makes no difference to your practice as a revolutionary whether or not there's a massive slump that throws capitalism into an even deeper crisis than the crisis of the 1930s, which is what the Trotskyist movement believed on the basis of Trotsky's predictions during and after the Second World War, or whether, as actually happened, capitalism went into the longest boom of its history. That's an enormous difference for revolutionaries' ability to intervene, to build, to influence workers, whether capitalism is in crisis, the level of class struggle, and so on. The point of theory is an instrument to grasp the way in which the world is moving to allow us better, or sometimes less better, to intervene in and influence events. Now, the alternative to any such essentially scientific analysis of the objective situation is, I think, moralism. the idea that the duty of revolutionaries is to make the revolution, and to build revolutionary parties really irrespective of the objective situation. Now, of course, that's true at one level. We always have to try and build revolutionary organisation. But at the same time, we know from our own experience the disastrous damage that was done to the left in Britain by its failure over the past 10 years to recognise the actual downturn that occurred in the class struggle. Now, I think that also, in the specific case of LO, treating Marxism as essentially a moral doctrine, we continue to keep faith in the revolution in the working class, irrespective of the objective situation and how it's changing and developing, has very serious practical consequences. You see, the LO comrades place overriding, absolute and unconditional emphasis on building in the workplaces, so that their supporters in Britain issued an open letter to the British left after the election in which they said what we've got to do is to orient on the working class to build groups of revolutionary workers in the workplaces. And this is a matter essentially of principle. Now, part of the justification for this focus on building in individual workplaces is that it is the duty of revolutionaries always to relate to the entire working class. Whatever revolutionaries are doing, whatever their strength, whatever the state of the class struggle, we must relate to the whole working class. Now that implies treating the working class as an entity that is somehow undifferentiated. There are no conflicts within the working class, no different levels of consciousness, no different levels of political organisation within the working class. And that in turn leads to one consequence, which is a break on the part of LO, surprising such an orthodox organisation, from the Leninist approach to the elections. The LO comrades really it's very sad, but lined up with ultra-left sects like the RCP in attacking the SWP for campaigning for a Labour vote in the last general election. They said that we were coattailing reformism and so on. In the bulletin that they helped produce at King's Cross, they said, however each of us votes, whatever the outcome of June the 11th, let's get prepared for the real battles. However each of us vote. In other words, the size of the Labour vote and so on doesn't matter to us as revolutionaries. Now, we know from our own experience of the election what a badly mistaken position that is. We know that for various reasons which I won't go into, but one particularly important reason is because the working class isn't an undifferentiated entity, but within the working class there exists a layer of militants who have a contradictory consciousness, who are trade union militants, but have a labourist political consciousness, who see the Labour Party and elections still as the way of changing society. Now, it's very important for revolutionaries to be able to relate to those kind of workers, calling for a vote for the Labour Party, but at the same time being ruthlessly critical of the Labour Party as an essentially capitalist party, is an essential part of our dialogue with those kinds of workers. Now, really, the approach that the LO comrades argue involves abandoning that as a serious approach. The irony, though, is that when we look at the LO comrades' practice in France itself, despite LO's claim to be related to the entire working class, in practice, their practice leads them actually to make concessions to the consciousness of militant workers, to their sectional consciousness. See, the LO comrade methods of building involves essentially working inside particular workplaces through producing workplace bulletins like the ones their comrades, their co-thinkers are producing at King's Cross. One particular element of this is they reject the idea that revolutionaries can relate to workplaces and relate to workers' struggles from the outside. That won't do because that's tourism. Revolutionary tourism. Now that is a practice which has extremely serious consequences, and I'm just going to mention a couple of those controversies. First of all, it means that they don't work around important strikes where they don't have members. I don't want to go into the details of it. This is gone into very well by our comrades in Société Internationale, our French sister organisation, in an excellent critique of LO that they produced. A number of major strikes at places like Citroën, Talbot, the Post and Telecommunications, which LO ignored because they didn't have members inside it. Even more serious, it is apparently the case that LO comrades oppose collecting money in support of other workers' strikes. That they, for example, compared collecting money for the miners' strike in this country as charity. Now, we know from our experience of the miners' support groups how important collecting money for the miners was as developing a broad movement of solidarity was the most important struggle to have taken place in this country for many years. I mean, personally, I can't really believe that LO takes the position of opposing solidarity collections, and it's one thing I'd like Francois to clarify. What happens, though, when LO does have members on the inside, within particular workplaces? Well, the best example of that is the rail strike that took place in France at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. Very important strike, very high level of rank and file organisation, and within the strike, LO comrades had a very important influence. I mean, there are few other cases that I can think of where Trotskyists actually played a really leading role in a major strike. You have to think about things like the Minneapolis Teamsters back in 1934. In that respect, very, very important that the LO comrades had such influence. However, what did they do with this influence? And here we see the problems with the kind of approach that I've been describing. What they did, essentially, was to confine themselves to working within one of the two rank-and-file committees that emerged in the strike, and they played an important role in building that committee, and it was the more important of the broader of the two committees. It was, in itself, that was an extremely important thing for them to have done. Nothing that I say is intended to belittle that achievement. However, one of the major problems with the strike was that while it was a rank-and-file strike, there was fantastic... one important element in the consciousness of the rail workers involved in the strike was a sectional consciousness. There was sectionism both among rail workers, the more skilled workers, the drivers, looking down on other categories of rail workers. There was also sectionism between rail workers and other groups of workers. The rail workers, particularly the drivers, felt they didn't need the support of other groups of workers in order to win their strike. A very serious mistake on that part, because particularly in a period like the present, and the state of the class struggle is no better in France than it is in Britain in broad terms. Generalisation, linking up with other groups of workers, and in that way developing the kind of power that is needed to take on the employers and the state in a situation in which capital is on the offensive, is extremely important. Now, no doubt the LO comrades tried to combat these sectionist tendencies inside the rank-and-file committees themselves. I've got no doubt that they did that. However, there was absolutely no political intervention by LO as an organisation openly arguing for a particular strategy in order to win the strike. The newspaper LO wasn't used as an instrument of revolutionary intervention to argue for the kind of strategy of generalisation that was necessary in order to win a really massive victory against the employers in the state and shift the whole balance of class forces in France radically in favour of the working class. In consequence, a leaflet was finally issued by the broader of the rank-and-file committees, appealing to other groups of workers a couple of days before the strike ended. In other words, a major opportunity, not simply to win the strike, because I think that's whether or not the strike could have been won is relatively, although important, isn't the crucial question here, but a major opportunity to broaden the influence of revolutionaries not simply among rail workers, but in the working class generally and in other sections of the population, students and so on, was thrown away. And it seems to us to be a real tragedy, and a tragedy which reflects on the part of LO a concession to the sectional consciousness of particular groups of workers, in this case the rail workers. Now, I think if you compare our role in the miners' strike, you see the difference in the approach. We started out with hardly any members in the fields. We concentrated on general political intervention around the strategy which could win the strike. Mass picketing steel, all sorts of things like that. At certain points, we had an impact within at least sections of the anyway. Out of our intervention, we recruited a significant number of miners from the outside through the general work of our party branches, which provides the very embryonic beginnings of some kind of revolutionary cadre in the coal fields. I don't exaggerate the significance, but a real, I think something, a very, very small breakthrough was made. More generally, we built the Socialist Workers' Party. We built a larger, stronger, and clearer revolutionary organisation. Why is that important? Because the larger, the stronger, the more politically coherent the revolutionary organisation is, irrespective of the class composition of its membership, the better that organisation will be able to relate to, influence workers' struggles when they develop on a large scale, and win workers to their organisation. Why am I so sure of that? Because that's what we, the International Socialists, we then were able to do in the early 1970s. Essentially a student organisation, although a student organisation of some size, was able to recruit significant numbers of militant workers and to build factory branches. In a similar upturn to the upturn of the early 1970s, we in the SWP can do that again, without making the kind of concessions to the sectional consciousness of workers which, unfortunately, LO has made. This brings me to my conclusion. Revolutionary Party is essentially a combat organisation, has to be a combat organisation capable of responding to shifts and changes in the class struggle. To have that capacity to respond, the revolutionary Marxist tradition, not simply as a set of sterile dogmas, but as a living theory which we constantly seek to develop and apply to the world around us, is absolutely essential. The problem with LO is, despite its achievements, and its achievements are real in building an organisation of some substantial size by the very minuscule standards of the revolutionary left, and with some roots in the working class, despite those achievements, its theoretical rigidity leads also to rigidity in practice, the obsession of working from the inside, which means, in the end, an essentially syndicalist approach to building a revolutionary organisation. In the end, nothing will come out of that.
Thank you, comrades. Could I remind you once more about the speaker slips that the stewards are handing out around the room? Could you put your name and the name of your organisation so we can ensure we get as balanced a debate as possible? I'd like to introduce now to reply on behalf of LO, Francois Rouault.
Okay, comrades. First of all, I would like to bring you the fraternal greetings of my comrades from Lute Ouvrier in France and from the comrades of the International Communist Union. Now, I'm not going to answer all the points made by Alex because I wouldn't have time really, too many of them. But I would like, through an example, which deals with a lot of what Alex has been saying, I would like to deal with that first bit he puts in his contribution, which says that lays down the importance of theory. Well, comrades, I think this is a question of method and understanding apparently of what the Marxist method is about. And I will take an example to illustrate what I mean by that. I will take what the SWP calls a theoretical issue, which is the downturn theory, which is very important since it has shaped the whole policy of the SWP for the last few years. Now, on what facts was based the downturn theory? Since 1934, the world economy has been in crisis, in particular the British economy has been in continuous crisis. Rising unemployment has meant fewer strikes, less militancy, and more cynicism in the working class. In Britain, in particular, that has been translated by lower membership in the trade unions. Nevertheless, the working class as a whole has not been defeated up to now, if only because there have been no decisive struggles involving the mass of British workers. These comrades are the facts. Yet, starting from those facts, the SWP has evolved an abysmal pessimism which is embodied in their idea of the downturn. Take, for instance, the SWP's approach of all the struggles that have taken place for the last few years in the working class. It has been consistently the same According to the SWP, these struggles were doomed to be defensive, isolated, dominated by the trade union bureaucracy, and eventually defeated. This approach sums up much of the SWP's attitude in the present period. This period is grim, it is dull, it is difficult. The SWP contrasts this grimness to what happened in the previous period, that is in the late 60s and early 70s, which they described as a kind of paradise for revolutionary activists in which everything was possible. In fact, back in those days, we used to argue with the IS comrades what we saw as the over-optimistic assessment that they have of the political situation. The IS comrades seemed to have a lot of illusions at that time. Indeed, it could only take a lot of illusions for the IS to describe more or less the events in France in 1968 or in Portugal in 1974 as revolutions. Maybe the same kind of illusions have led the comrades to overestimate the potential of the upsurge of militancy in the British working class at the same time. Maybe they felt deeply disappointed when in the late 70s they realized suddenly that despite all their expectations, nothing fundamental had changed, and in particular that the SWP, as all the existing groups in the left in Europe, remained a small group having little impact on the political reality despite its growth. Maybe after all, the SWP has had more illusions about that period than the working class itself, and as a result, got more demoralized when the trend changed. Maybe this is what accounts for the SWP fatalist attitude of these last years. Needless to say, we do not share the present SWP's pessimism any more than we shared their over-optimism in the past. We do not think that there is such a difference between the previous period and the present period. Of course, we recognize, and who would not, that in general terms it's more difficult to argue revolutionary politics in the working class today. But for smaller organizations like the SWP and ELO, which are by the sheer virtue of their small size much less receptive to the ups and downs of the working class than mass organizations, these change shouldn't be a major change. Nor do we see a major difference in the potentialities of the class struggle between then and now. For all their militancy, the working class was and is still dominated by the reformist organizations. On the other hand today, the bureaucracy is weaker at shop floor level. There is a political vacuum that revolutionary organizations, such as the SWP and ELO, may be in a position to fill in the coming period. That is, of course, provided they have a policy aiming at building this influence. So, it is true, we do have a difference in the assessment of the present period. But is it a fundamental one? Should it lead our organizations to see differently the primary task for revolutionaries at the present time? Well, we do not think so at all. What we see as the primary task of revolutionary militants at the present time, be it in Britain, in France, or anywhere else, does not flow from the temporary ups and downs of the class struggle. It flows from the understanding, and this is about theory, comrades, from the understanding of the main problem with which the revolutionary movement has been confronted for over 50 years, namely the gap created internationally by Callinicos between revolutionary politics and the working class. The degeneracy of Russia, followed by that of the world communist movement, have given an image of communism, which is either that of the dictatorship of the bureaucracy in Russia or that of pure reformism, if not both. Stalinist communist parties have taken care of isolating revolutionary militants in the workplaces. As a result today, revolutionary politics are not seen by the working class as something coming from their own ranks. They see it as something alien to the labor movement and to their own struggles. And it's quite interesting to listen to the criticism which are made by the SWP on our intervention in the strike in France. You see, intervening from the outside in struggles has been transformed from a proof of weakness into a virtue. It is the case that the left is much too weak in many places, in many countries and in many strikes to intervene from the ranks of the workers on the basis of strength, on the basis of people who support their ideas and support their activity and have been supporting their activity for years. Therefore, revolutionary militants have to be satisfied to come from the outside. But comrades, this is definitely a proof of our total failure of building our strength in the working class. It's certainly not a virtue. Now this gap that exists between the revolutionary ideas and the working class has to be filled. Up to now, the Trotskyist movement has failed to do so. But if we are one day to lead the working class on the way to the proletarian revolution, then we have to recognize that establishing revolutionary politics as an integral part of the working class movement must be our primary task today, as it was yesterday and as it will be tomorrow until this gap is filled. We must recognize that the revolutionary party we all want to build will only be built through the completion of that task. And we must recognize that this task has to be undertaken whatever the difficulties or the grimness of the situation. In order to bridge that gap, we need in practical terms to build roots for our organizations in the working class. Building roots for revolutionary politics in the working class, that is in the workplaces, does not mean, as most activists on the left think, that revolutionary militants have to confine themselves to trade union activity. In fact, the trade unions are only one of the channels through which revolutionary militants can intervene in the working class. Their importance as a means of intervention varies according to the general situation. Revolutionary militants have to be active in the trade unions, but trade union activity only allows you to reach a limited number of workers and to raise a limited number of issues. This is all the more true today, of course. Therefore, it is of paramount importance for revolutionary militants to find other channels to intervene, allowing them to address larger layers of workers and to win them their trust as revolutionary militants. This is what we mean by building roots in the working class. We have to bear in mind that when the upturn comes, or any upsurge in working class struggles comes, there is no guarantee whatsoever that the mass of the workers, or even any significant numbers, will look towards well-known established revolutionary militants having built their influence as revolutionaries over years of intervention. But we can be absolutely sure that if they cannot see such militants in their own ranks, then the working class will not turn towards revolutionary militants. Therefore, we need to recruit and train working class militants, but we also need to devote a lot of our energy to help these comrades not only to become skilled in Marxist politics, but also to become respected and influential among their fellow workers as revolutionaries. We need to give them as much political and practical backing as required to do that. All the more so as we are in a period which is more difficult, in which revolutionary militants can find themselves more easily isolated. No one should underestimate that task. It is difficult, and we certainly do not. We know from experience that this is hard work, particularly for our working class comrades, but also for our organization as a whole. But there is no other way. There is no easy shortcut, comrades. And it doesn't help very much to use the difficulties of any particular period as an excuse not to undertake that task. Yet, this is exactly the attitude that the SWP have been adopting for the last few years. They say that revolutionary militants should take shelter in order to protect themselves from the right-wing shift which they saw in the working class. There was nothing revolutionary militants could do on a day-to-day basis in the workplaces, apart from selling their papers to a handful of individuals. That the only possibility, the only possible way of intervening in working class struggle, big or small, was through general propaganda, targeted at the minority of more politicized workers, rather than attempting to open a perspective, allowing broader layers of workers to free themselves from the grip of the trade bureaucracy. This Congress amounts, in our view, to renouncing the task of building influence for revolutionary ideas in the working class as a whole. And it is a fundamental difference, in our view, the only fundamental difference that we have with the SWP. For none of our many programmatic differences with the SWP, such as the vast nature of the USSR, for instance, not even the difference we have in assessing the present situation, can be described as fundamental insofar as they have hardly any consequence, at least at our stage of development, in the real world. But for revolutionary organizations who claim to fight for the leadership of the working class, the approach to the class is of paramount importance. It has immediate practical consequences in the way they operate, as well as long-term ones. And the retreat from the class adopted by the SWP is, in our view, a retreat from their primary responsibility as a revolutionary organization. By the way, it is quite ironical that the SWP doesn't seem that effective when it comes to protecting their organization from the influence of the labor bureaucracy. Take their position in the election. The SWP has over 4,000 members. It is both a significant and a small number as regards the task of a revolutionary organization. It is certainly too small in electoral terms to get large support on the bill, but it is much too significant to simply remain on the sidelines. Yet, the SWP did remain on the sidelines. They did fail to use that opportunity. By sending candidates in as many constituencies as was practicable, the SWP could have shown clearly to millions of workers where revolutionaries stood in relation to the rotten politics of the Labour Party. On the contrary, the SWP chose to make up a whole theory explaining that the Labour vote is a class vote. In fact, it seems that in order not to displease the Labour activists, the SWP chose to dismiss that minority of workers who were angry and disgusted by the politics of the Labour Party and might have felt reinforced by hearing a different voice in the campaign. Could it be that in this particular instance, the SWP has been giving in to the influence of the Labour bureaucracy? Could it be that, after all, the SWP sees the influence of the working class as more of a danger than that of the Labour bureaucracy? The SWP says that today the main task is to build their organization. It is ironical again to see Marxists claiming to build an organization while at the same time saying that any attempt to intervene in the working class other than through propagandistic explanations is pointless. For Marxists, ideas are means for action, and the only justification for building an organization is that it improves the capacity of all its members to act upon events. Such does not seem to be the SWP's approach. The SWP sees as a primary aim the training of their members. We definitely go along with this preoccupation, although we would say that this should be a constant preoccupation for revolutionary militants, regardless of the period. But, comrades, what sort of training can you deliver in isolation from the working class and from the class struggle? Reading books, organizing educational, are necessary and basic things. But this is only half of the necessary training for revolutionaries. The other part, which is just as important, involves learning how our ideas relate to the class struggle, how we can use them not only to understand events, but also to act upon them, however minute these events may be. No, comrades, training militants in test tubes cannot and does not work. As Marxists, we cannot separate the training of our militants from their active involvement in the class struggle. That is from a practical intervention aiming at influencing the course of the class struggle. Learning how to influence the class struggle, or rather, given our numbers, how to attempt influencing events, involves learning to do a lot of things. How to accept the mood, the anger and the desires of rank and file workers, how to express the best of their feelings while avoiding attacking to them in order to take them a step further, how to bring workers to be the militants and the leaders of their own fight, how to build on the workers' militancy and conscious action to oppose the maneuvers of the bureaucracy. This is what we all have to learn. None of that knowledge is to be found in books. But there are no struggles going on, would say the SWP. Well, comrades, there will be no strikes, but workers have to grapple with all sorts of dirty tricks day after day, and they do react in a lot of ways. It's up to us to make the best of this reaction, to use them to build our influence, as well as to train ourselves for the future bigger struggle. We are, all of us, in the business of fighting for leadership of the working class in the future. We are in the business of building a party which will have to lead the working class struggle's power. No doubt such a party will be forged through large struggles. But the reverse is not necessarily true, comrades. Large struggles do not automatically bring about a revolutionary party. This will only happen if revolutionary militants are in a position to play a role in these struggles. If they have the numbers and the politics, but also the experience and the credibility. Getting the necessary credibility and experience does not require large struggles, otherwise we would be stuck in a vicious circle. This is something we can do and we must do right now, despite the low ebb of class struggle. Such is exactly the aim of our workplace bulletins, not only in France, but also in the West Indies and in the United States. We do not think workplace bulletins are a universal magical recipe which should be used regardless of the situation. But they have proved through decades of activity to be a valid answer to the many problems facing revolutionary militants in those countries, namely their isolation from the working class, their lack of credibility, of influence and of experience. Problems which are identical to those facing militants in Britain. Workplace bulletins have been and are a means to focus the activity of our organization towards recruiting and training working class militants who are revolutionaries, who argue their politics in the workplace, but who are also directly involved in every aspect of the class struggle, and first and foremost seek the conscious intervention of rank and file workers as the only way to fight against the grip of the bureaucracy. This orientation does not exclude having many other activities, addressing other social layers and other issues, but it does ensure that the main thrust of our energy is focused towards the completion of our primary task. This is not to say, comrades, that our way is the only possible way of building the revolutionary party, but this is to say that the SWP's way does not seem to be one which can address the problems we are facing in relation to our class.
Thank you, comrades. Now I'm going to start calling speakers. Before I do so, could I urge once again that if there are any members or supporters of the LO who wish to speak, to hand in slips to allow the debate to continue. Also, of course, any members of the Labour Party here who'd like to take part in this discussion, we welcome their contributions as well. I'm going to call names two at a time, so that when I announce the second name for that person, please make sure that they've made their way to the front of the room in order that we save time and don't waste a lot of time waiting for people to get to the microphone. Each speaker on the floor will be allowed 3 minutes. I want to call Paul McGarr from the SWP, followed by Anna Ryan from the International Communist Union.
Well, time prevents us going into many of the contradictions, irrationalities and stupidities really in the contribution of the comrade from Lute Ouvrier. I think that's what many of them are. Let's take up three really. Firstly, the notion that the SWP is pessimistic and demoralised. For a start, that's not something I've noticed being around here the last few days, and I've been used to many of the comrades here. But more importantly, the notion that in strikes, occurred over the last few years. We've said inevitably before June to defeat because of the paralysing effect of the trade union bureaucracy and confine ourselves to a small amount of propaganda on the fringes of those strikes. Actually, comrades who have lived through that period and comrades who have heard meetings from it will know that's extremely far from the truth. In a miners' strike, for instance, we were continually agitating. The strike can be won. The grip of the trade union bureaucracy can be broken. Mass picketing and lobbying, mass picketing around steel. Again, you think of the NGA strike, which preceded the miners' strike. And that strike, again, we said, unless the grip of the union bureaucracy is broken, that strike will go down with defeat. But that grip can be broken if the militants organise an all-out strike in Fleet Street and so on and so forth. Think of our intervention in the civil service strike at this very moment. Actually, far from just abstaining and standing on the sidelines since June to defeat, we're actually virtually the only people who have gone out there arguing this strike can be won, fight for victory in the ballot, organise the people, the possibility of taking that strike to victory. Actually, when people talk about being pessimistic, I think Francois is a pessimist. When, for instance, he says something like there was no possibility of workers' revolution in Portugal in 1975, they're the pessimist, certainly not the SWP. The second, the greater point I want to make really, is in terms of the issues that Francois adopts. Apparently we fundamentally agree, Lute Ouvrier and the SWP, except for a few minor issues, such as the class nature of the Soviet Union, only one of the most important issues which has dominated the entire left movement since the early years of this century, since the Russian Revolution of 1917. I won't go into the details of it, but actually to maintain that the Soviet Union is a worker state of any description is a fundamental and total breach of a very heart and principle of Marxism, that worker states, workers' power depends on the self-activity, the control of the state, and the means of production from below by the working class. That's hardly a minor point, comrades. That's a fundamental point which divides Lute Ouvrier and us right down the middle. They have broken from revolutionary Marxism at every stage on that argument. And the very final point, really, when people talk about standing on the sidelines in the election, I don't think we did stand on the sidelines. Actually, our intervention related to wide members of the working class, that substantial minority who rejected Thatcherism, rejected capitalism, actually wanted to see some kind of change. Our intervention actually addressed those people. Again, think back to the mid-1970s, the Anti-Nazi League, when there was growth of racism in Britain, organised presence of the National Front on the streets. Again, who was it who took the initiative, reached out to a wide base of people who were against the fascists, organised them and successfully stopped that march of the fascists to strength. And you contrast that with the attitude of Lute Ouvrier in France to the growth of racism there. Of course, there are important differences, but a chronically abstentionist position, chronically standing back passively on the sidelines. So it's not possible to build any kind of room, which is absolutely necessary in France. Communists Lute Ouvrier who abstain from any real connection with the struggle by retreating from any connection with the direct struggle of the other day. But when they say we have to train militants to build a party, yes, we have to train them to understand the theory. We can't say that the class nature of the Soviet Union is irrelevant. We also have to train them how to intervene correctly in the here and now.
What I want to address really is something that Alex Callinicos mentioned. He said that Lute Ouvrier doesn't really recognise the different levels of consciousness in the working class. It's not homogeneous. So that it's not homogeneous. Did you hear the thing? the idea that we don't recognise that working class isn't homogeneous, that there are different levels of consciousness. And we actually do agree with that. And what I want to talk about really is how do we actually relate to those militants who we regard as more conscious and more politicised, and particularly those who are inside the Labour Party and activists in the trade union movement. And how do we, for the Revolutionary Party, respect to those people? We're talking about people who are actually committed to the working class and see the defence of the working class as their crime aim in life. Not academics, but people who recognise that in order to change things, that battles have got to be won involving hundreds of thousands of workers. Now, it's not really enough to bring the correct ideas to these people, because ideas, however right they may be, are not immediately relevant to workers, because there's no reason to take them on board until they find they need them for their struggles. The militants who would like to involve with us are already in large organisations. These organisations still have some credibility, at least more than ours, and they seem to offer some possibilities compared to our small revolutionary organisations, which have not yet shown, and this is true really, that they've not shown that they can have some influence on working class struggles and some decisive influence. Consequently, we have first to demonstrate in front of these militants that our ideas are effective as regards the interests of the working class. We can't hope to influence struggle or win over these Labour Party activists and trade unions who have illusions in reformism by simply having a good relationship with them and discussing with them. When the crunch comes, the majority of them won't choose our side against the Labour Party or the bureaucracy in the trade unions. However, if we do manage to get the support of significant layers of workers for our policy in a struggle, and if we manage to lead that struggle further than the bureaucracy would lead us, yes, then the Labour influence militants may actually be convinced to join us. And they'll actually be watching us carefully, because they're not without doubts in the Labour Party and the trade union bureaucracy. It may actually seem to be a paradox, because I'm saying that it's more likely that we're able to organise those workers in the here and now who are less politicised than those who are politicised but active in the Labour Party and the trade unions. So what I'm really saying is that the SWP, with their orientation to that layer, in fact, are putting the cart before the horse. And I think that the movement can't really go forward this way. Implantation in the working class is not a quick and easy process. There's no way around it for revolutionary. We're serious about building a revolutionary party.
Thank you. Maureen Watson from the SWP, followed by Fabrice from LO.
I just want to come back to some of the things that Francois said, because I find it very interesting. When Francois was at a meeting on the mass strike yesterday, what he argued was that the reason why the German Revolution was possible was because the shop stewards had built up an organisation through the war, and the conclusion that he drew from that was that it was workplace politics, having no plantation in the workplace, that is the key thing. Now, when we look at the German Revolution, we start from the basis of why was it defeated. We say it was defeated, and we conclude it was defeated because the political organisation that was necessary to pull workers away from reformism did not exist in Germany. The conclusion we draw from that is that we need to build a sort of political organisation so that in the event of that happening, there will be a pole of attraction, workers will be pulled away from reformism and will be on to revolutionary politics. Now that sounds like the sort of ideas that possibly Francois Lute Ouvrier would say are abstract. Actually, I think they have a resonance, they actually are fantastically important in the way that we operate in the here and now today. I was lucky enough to go from the Socialist Workers to report on the French railway workers strike at the beginning of this year. And what I saw there made me a mixture of being excited and also fantastically saddened. I was excited because the anger, the militancy, the will to fight that was there was exciting. I was saddened, I was depressed, because there was nobody absolutely nobody that was actually taking on the arguments that were coming from the Communist Party trade unions, the Socialist Party trade unions, the sort of arguments that are very familiar that we see played out wherever workers try to fight back, wherever we see people trying to hand back to actually squash what's going on. And really, what we saw and what we had discussions with comrades in the Lute Ouvrier was it went like this. And it really reminded me of the sort of arguments that you hear from people in the military, from people in the Labour Party in Britain. Here you have Lute Ouvrier in a fantastic position in one of the rail depots. They really were in a position to take the lead. And what they said was, you can't go more than one step ahead. You always have to remember where everybody else is. What did that mean in practice? In practice, it meant that there was no differentiation between what was going on in that rail depot and what was happening in the other rail depots. When we talked to the rail workers, well, what's going to happen in the strike is that we will win. How are you going to win? Actually, just continue along the same way. What about spreading it to the other groups of workers that are actually taking action now? We can't really go to them and ask them because it's not up to us. In the end of the day, what that really meant is that Francois and Lute Ouvrier have more in common with reformism than what they actually say. The truth of the matter is this: reformism depends on the separation of politics and economics. Actually, politics means conducting a fight within the working class as well as a fight against the capitalist class. That is completely lacking with Lute Ouvrier. We call it syndicalism.
So we'd Alex would have to state us how you could decide both conservatism, as he stated, and reformism, which is something awkward. So I won't be reading about this. I will be reading about something which hasn't been dealt with yet. I think the building of the international legislative code, one of the common tasks we all have today. As far as the period is concerned, there is not, of course, an international. There is not even, there is not an international community, of course, but not even something that could be compared to what existed at Trotskyist time, that is, a leadership, a responsible leadership that was undisputable and recognized by all revolutionaries around the world. So, we all lack this. In the last few years, and even more in the last decade, there have been a series of events, of struggles, of fights, and sometimes uprisings, from which, first, where revolutionaries did not play a role, and even less a significant role, but worse, about which and from which they haven't been able to learn anything. Why? Because today, every organization, and including this, the SWP and the Ouvrier, is limited to its own national struggle, to its own national experience, and has no relation with the international struggles taking place abroad, because it has no real implantation and link with these militants that are miles and thousands of miles away. So we all like this, and the way, this common framework, which is an international, in which everyone learns from the other experience, in which every experience in a country is profitable, enriches the other groups, doesn't exist. We cannot build that one, we agree. But what we can do is right on now to form, to educate militants that were activists, revolutionary activists, cadres that could have an international experience, that could have an international political education.
You begin to wind up.
Sorry? Yeah. This could be the future framework, future skeleton of the future international. The education of such cadres requires that our organization, and I hope yours is such, feels responsible towards the whole of the revolutionary movement around the world. It doesn't require that we have a total agreement on all points of the today's activity in struggle. But
This is why we have proposed to the SWP that some of the militants, of the SWP, should come to France and be active within our ranks, on our bases, and have thus an experience of the French struggle, and that some of Lute Ouvrier militants came down to England and be active in your ranks, on our policy, on your policies, on your activity, and as such an experience there. Another way, or in the same way, we have also made a proposal that after this debate, both our leaderships have a regular exchange of views on the political situation, on what's taking place, and on the way we intervene in it. And we hope that after this debate, after the debate in the classroom issue, after the debate that has taken place today, and that feeds on in the next issue of international socialism, we hope that the SWP will give a positive answer to our proposals.
Okay, thank you. Right. First in International, followed by Roger M. from Lute Ouvrier.
In case any of the Socialist Workers' Party comrades are thinking of taking up the invitation, here's what's waiting for you. I'm going to talk about how Lute Ouvrier actually operate in France. I think it's interesting to see, given that they say that theory isn't important, what is their actual practice? Let's take elections for a start. I think it's significant that Lute Ouvrier, although they say they're not electoralists, they're prepared to abandon even their own principles for the sake of the election. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. You may have noticed that the comrades from Lute Ouvrier don't actually give their names. That's because in France, in their organisation, everybody has a pseudonym. And even the radio station has a pseudonym. And then come the elections. What do? They put up 900, 1,000 candidates. And the problem is that being a bourgeois democracy in France, you can't actually stand as the Lone Ranger or something. You actually have to give your real name, your address, and so on. So on the one hand, you've got this principle of clandestinity, secrecy, and so on. But then, come an election, they're prepared to abandon that because, God knows why, they'll explain perhaps. Another thing on the elections in France is worth knowing. If you want to stand for president, you've got to get the signatures of 500 mayors of towns and villages, which means that for months before the elections, people from Lute Ouvrier are taking their holidays, they're going on sick leave and so on, and they're spending their time going up and down mountains and valleys to the remote corners of France, trying to find somebody prepared to actually sign this paper. Meantime, what's happening to all the contacts? What's happening to all the working class that's supposed to be addressing? If they're not a mayor, you can forget it. And what's the result of all this? You get a candidate in the election, and that means that sometime during the campaign, you're going to get 3 minutes on the television between an advert for toothpaste and a variety show. Is it really worth it, Francois? Another thing, when he talks about addressing the whole class, how did they actually do this, in between running up and down mountains and valleys looking for mayors? One thing they do is they've got big postal campaigns in Paris, and I'll give you an idea of not only do they make concessions to electoralism, they also make concessions to reformism. I could quote a few of these posters, for example, saying, yes, of course businesses must thrive, but not at the expense of the workers. Can you imagine any other way of them thriving in capitalism? Yes, if only there was a courageous government that could have stopped the flight of capital and made some useful investments here in France. Is that really the job of a revolutionary organisation, to call for a courageous government to tell capitalists where to invest and not to exploit workers?
You begin to wonder.
Yeah. Finally then, these posters incidentally weren't signed. I don't know if they were ashamed of them. Maybe it's the Lone Ranger syndrome again. They just suddenly come up in the night and they're gone with the wind or something. Anyway, last thing, on struggles which actually do happen, when people actually are struggling, what do Lute Ouvrier do? Alex has quoted the case of a big strike under the socialist government in a car plant, where the socialist government was talking racist arguments about immigrant workers being led by ayatollahs and so on. What was Lute Ouvrier? They had nothing. They had no militants in this strike, so they abstained. Another example, which is maybe relevant for lots of people here, when the big anti-racist organisation, SWP, had a big concert in Paris a couple of years ago. About 300,000 people there, ready to fight racism. Lute Ouvrier went along, true, but as they went along with stewards, because they said to sell your paper in those circumstances is sectarian. And given the headline, I think that week in the paper was the entry of Spain and Portugal into the common market won't change anything for the workers. It's maybe true, but is it really relevant to 300,000 people who are there to fight racism, or at least have an idea, when you don't know, you don't put your politics forward? So it's fine. I'll finish up by saying that the way forward to build a revolutionary party, it's not to make concessions to electoralism, it's not to make concessions to abstentionism, and it's certainly not to make concessions to reformism. Thank you.
Followed by Brian MacDonald from the SWP.
My name is Roger. I've never been candidate to the elections, and if you want, anyway, but if you want to discuss with me after, we can discuss very openly. Now, we have to discuss seriously with revolutionary comrades about the railway strike, because Alex talked about it. And he said we had an influence. So first, you must know that we are not the influence of a complete movement, of course. There are 200,000 workers, 1,500 strikers, and at the most important moment, we were leading the striking committee, which was representing 15,000 workers. That was the reality. So we know that there were a lot of limits in this movement, and a lot of limits in what the workers were thinking too. But is that the problem that Alex was discussing? No, the comrade Alex was discussing about our lacking of political influence in the movement. If you listen to comrade Alex, if you read Socialist Review, you will know that we haven't any policy in the movement. There was no political appearance of the left-wing groups. That's what he said. But that must be a joke. We can't recognize the railway strike in that. Because everybody, the workers, not only the railway, but every worker in France, knew that comrades of Lute Ouvrier were leading the movement. The bourgeois press, the government were talking about the comrades of Lute Ouvrier leading the movement because they say they think that it could prevent the workers to follow them. So everybody knew, and that was the first time that the members, since a lot of years, and Alex said it too, and it was right, everybody knew that members, activists of left-wing groups, of the Trotskyists group, revolutionary members, were leading the working class fight. And that is, I think, an important issue that should raise a lot of questions for comrades. And the first question is, how was it possible? Of course, it wasn't possible because we came selling our paper. It was possible because we had real activists in the railway depot, among the railway drivers. We had real activists with flesh and blood defending their ideas every day on every issue of the working class, on every little thing you had to defend yourself and to fight back against the bosses and against the railway. That is what you do. That's what you did to sum up. All right. The other thing is about the political demands we didn't push forward. Alex Callinicos said at any moment, Lute Ouvrier, notice what he said, at any moment, Lute Ouvrier was tried to have a political intervention to argue the kind of strategy which was necessary to spread the strike. That's what he said. He didn't say that could be much more interesting which strategy it was to push forward and to spread the strike. Because what did we do? First, we were fighting against the sectionalists, and he said it himself. The workers were sectionalists, we crowd them in a working class committee, striking committee against sectionalism. All the categories were in it. Second, we were fighting for the wages. Chirac has just said, we will never raise the wages for any workers, never. So it was the most important political issue to discuss about the wages, and that's what we did. And we fought against the unions, against the press, against the ruling class, to ask the question of raising the wages in that strike. That's what we tried, and that's what we must discuss about. So we did not sell our paper, of course. Which is more efficient? to have 100, 200 workers and more saying to their comrades, we must fight to raise the wages, or to have a paper to say, let's fight against Chirac for raising the wages. Which is more efficient? We have two different conceptions of the efficiency. And I will finish on it. Comrades, we are really in a rush. We must find today the comrades who will defend our policy, who will relate the Marxist politics to the fight back of the working class. We are in a rush because maybe the crisis may break. Maybe the fight back will begin. We don't know. So let us hurry to find them. That is the responsibility of the revolutionary activists. Your responsibility and our responsibility. I think we have to think about it.
Thank you. Brian McDonald from the SWP, followed by Norman, an international communist union supporter. Yes, comrade. I think Callinicos accuses Lute Ouvrier of showing contempt for theory. Well, from what I've heard today, I think in a way, really what I've got from what comrades from Lute Ouvrier said, in a sense, there's a contempt for the working class in terms of ideas. I mean, what does any worker who gets interested in Marxism, who's drawn to the ideas of revolutionary socialism, what kind of ideas actually come to the fore in their minds? The ideas of Russia, the idea of whether half the world's population actually lives under socialist states or not. But yet this is simply not a fundamental question. It's an incredible idea to me. Somehow workers are interested in strikes, they're interested in their wages, which of course they are interested in. But when they get into politics, that's enough. The theories for the likes of Callinicos and for the rest of us, we're really there just to hand out leaflets on picket lines. That's a complete divergence between the way we see things and the way we see things. I think it's very important, and that leads directly into practice. The idea there's no difference between us, apart from things like unimportant things like Russia, but we can do the same. I mean, the practice is different, but the theory is different. When you look at the practice, what strikes you about what's happened over the last year in France, a whole number of things you can hardly believe when you hear them, like there are no revolutionary paper sellers on the huge student demonstration in France, that hundreds of thousands of young people who want to fight racism can go to concerts, can go to rallies, and there's no one selling revolutionary paper to them. And that actually comes from that idea of how socialists who created might actually fight for socialism. Because it's almost like an automatic connection between students fighting to the authorities in terms of their college, and therefore there are revolutionary conclusions. Actually, there isn't. There has to be the intervention of revolutionary socialists. You can be hit over the head by a copper and put a whole number of different conclusions about how to stop that, from democratising the police force to electing a left government. Actually, these revolutionaries to explain the nature of the state, and the way you do that fundamentally is through a revolutionary paper. It's absolutely essential to the Leninist tradition and to our tradition. And when another comrade says, how can Alex call them the left and someone else gets up and calls them right wing and so on, there's a direct connection between those two things. I mean, to actually not refuse to stand outside the SOS meetings and so on, and to argue, it's sound, you can make a very radical argument for doing that. This is not a working class movement, these people are not working and so on and so on. Really what you're doing, you're abstaining in an appalling right-wing way from actually winning those people to revolutionary politics. And that relates, I think, that relates, I think, to Lute Ouvrier's view of how you build a party. That, in fact, you can win revolutionary socialists from students, from young people who aren't working, even from people from upper-class backgrounds and so on. You don't actually treat them like dirt. They have to prove themselves to be workers and so on. It seems to me to be the attitude that Lute Ouvrier has. To be honest, if people did the shift side voluntarily, got up because they thought they duty to the working class to sell the paper every day, 5:30 or whatever. I think the workers' problems are completely not insane. Norman, an RCU supporter, followed by Ross Harrell, Trotskyists Lute International.
Yeah, hello, comrades. Norman Zucker speaking in support of the positions put forward by the ICU speakers. I'd like to address some of the issues connected with the comments that we've heard already about organisations within the workplace. I want to say that I consider them, I support the views expressed by the fellow speakers, because I see that there are no shortcuts, no magical formulae, no magical waiting for an upturn to come shining over the horizon where we can actually suddenly intervene or begin establishing some kind of base or intervention. The only way forward is to begin to try building a base for a revolutionary party that is truly part of the working class. that takes up the issues and problems of the working class, that is part of its struggles, and that can try to build a leadership within the working class. We can only do this by intervening regularly, consistently and seriously in the everyday issues that affect workers in their daily lives and struggles. It's the everyday issues, it's the tiny issues, the working conditions, the trips of the buses, the issues about workplace, that take place day in, day out. These are the issues that we may consider insignificant if we're not working inside different workplaces, factories, where any of us is actually based. But these are the sort of sparks that we know can lead to the fires of class struggle. And it is quite easy to satirise these and dismiss them as insignificant. The kind of comments that have been addressed in the past about Allies intervention, the factory politicians addressing themselves to issues supposedly as significant as toilet paper. Issues, things like this, to deal with the indignities of working conditions, that lead people to become class-conscious workers. And it's not just about the economism, it's not just about the issues themselves, it's about the link between these and the politics of what these actually represent. By intervening in workers' struggles, we would also be helping workers organise. It's not just about printing the bulletins, if we want to talk about bulletins, or it's not just about writing the editorials, correct as we all hope they'll be, but it's about workers themselves owning these issues and owning these ideas, owning their struggles. What is the intervention that LO talks about? It's not about sending workers into factories as counterfeit workers, directing them towards industry, trying to conceal degrees with false addresses, as has been a habit on some groups on the left.
And you begin to want to.
It's not about industrial entryism. It's not about just getting a job and then moving on 9 months later when it doesn't work out or we don't establish the mass base that we want to do. Nor is intervention about turning up in workplaces when a dispute's on and then kissing them goodbye to when it's over, we haven't made any kind of contact. And it's not about, I hope the last speaker can various comments, it's not about various comments in mine rather, it's not about turning up to sell the paper, whichever paper it is, once every other blue moon and then like it's raining. There is no ready-made formula for intervention. As the speaker said from the platform, Francois said, factory politics are a means, not an upending principle. They act as the basis for contact and for organisation. We need to intervene according to our experiences, according to our means and our traditions of what we've done in the past. It's not a question of you've got to do the politics like sorry, comrade. We need to intervene consistently and seriously. Our achievements to begin with can only be modest. But we can only spread our influence and we can only grow together.
Thank you. Ross Harold from Socialist International, followed by Panos Karganis from Socialist Revolution of Greece.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to what Francois Woodall was saying about the beginning of his remarks. He said that he wasn't going to reply to everything because he couldn't go into all the detail of what Alex raised. And you might think that's fairly normal. It's 15 or 20 minutes discussion to speak. But although they may be a little surprised that he didn't address himself to such an important question as the development of the Eastern European states after the war and the contradiction that exists in the theory of Lute Ouvrier, maintaining on the one hand generated worker state in Russia and bourgeois states in the other countries. I've lived in France for over 10 years now, and I'm a member of the Société Internationale. I'm a lot less surprised now, because after endless conversations with members of Lute Ouvrier, there is no answer. You may think that they may, despite having an inconsistent position, they may have some sort of argument to explain this, but they really don't have an attempt to make an explanation of this. I'd just like to ask 3 questions to Francois Woodall, to give you an idea of the sort of debate, the sort of thing we're up against when we're talking to comrades in Lute Ouvrier. Just a simple question: is there a ruling class in the Eastern European societies, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on? What is this ruling class? Is it a bureaucracy? There is no answer on this. And to come to Alex's point, I think he's quite generous when he says that, he presumes that Ella has a position that these states are capitalists. If you ask members of Lute Ouvrier, are these states capitalists? They won't reply. I mean, I'd like to ask the question to Francois Woodall, and you'll see for yourselves. But I mean, it seems a bourgeois state would expect, those states to be our capitalist mode of production, but there is no analysis, no theory, no books, pamphlets, or anything that explain the nature of these societies. I hope you will be a little bit less surprised after this debate. Just coming back on what Roger was saying about the rail strike, because I think he's wrong about the intervention of the Lute Ouvrier in the rail strike. He started off by saying that there were limits to the abilities of Lute Ouvrier to intervene in the strike. That's true, when still, by revolutionary standards in Europe today, to lead a series of strike committees with 15,000 is still quite considerable, but it was a minority of the strike. But just because there were limits to the leadership of the revolutionary organisation, all the more reason for an organisation to be putting forward ideas and ways of how to win the strike. And he suggested that we should suggest how we get the wind up. Yeah, okay. One reason he said that everybody knew that the leader of the strike committees was a member of Lute Ouvrier. Everybody knew from the press that it was a Trotskyist agitator who was stopping people going on holidays. That was what was put across in the papers. What Lute Ouvrier had to put across was something completely different. And what they could have done was develop a strategy for developing mass pickets, for developing solidarity amongst other sections that break with the sectionalism of the other strike, things which they didn't do. And we may be worried that they don't agree with solidarity action. They're against collecting the solidarity because they consider it as charity. And on the level of more general propaganda, the role of a revolutionary newspaper to develop ideas about the role of the police, which intervened really strongly, the riot police, there was nothing. You go through all the newspapers during the strike of Lute Ouvrier, and there was nothing about the nature of the police, what they were, how they were intervening, the role of the police as part of the state, and so on. Nothing in terms of general propaganda that they could have been developing. Even if there had been, a lot of the rail workers wouldn't have known about it because they weren't selling the newspaper. Sorry, Rob. I think I'll end there. Yeah, thank you.
Mark from Greece, followed by Gareth Jenkins from the SWP.
Comrades, speaking as a revolutionary from a country outside both France and this country, it would have been very easy to say that take a symmetrical position between the two organizations. The SWP and Lute Ouvrier are fairly large organizations by the standards of today's revolutionary left. There isn't much left around. So it would be relatively easy to get into the trap. Well, what are they quarreling about? They both survived, they're both quite big, they're probably the same. In fact, this is not true. There are crucial differences. And I think the comrade from LO has summed up these differences very effectively when he contrasted the steadiness of Lute Ouvrier to the ups and downs of the SWP, the over-optimism of the 70s and the supposed over-pessimism of the 80s in the SWP. Now, this may sound that, who's the positive and who's the negative. I would say that the steadiness of Lute Ouvrier is the negative aspect, because it is a very abstract steadiness when you come to look into it. There are many, I won't go into the details because the examples have been given by many comrades that have spoken. It is a steadiness of a theory that is stuck a few decades ago. So it is very, very steady indeed, but it doesn't relate to anything else that's happening outside. The same is true of the intervention. The comrades are in there, in the workplace, where the little things take place every day. This may sound very steady and positive, but in fact, it is negative, because when you refuse the intervention from the outside, not only you miss out on the opportunities to grow as an organization from movements that arise outside the workplace and the workplaces in which you don't exist, but you also miss out on opportunities for the politics of the workers in the workplaces where you do intervene. Without intervention from the outside, your arguments are not very, very effective. You have to be confined to the little things, and you never reach to the big things unless you are prepared to intervene from the outside. So the argument is not who is inside and who is outside, but who is talking politics to the workers. Now, I believe this will demonstrate demonstrated during the recent events in France as well. There were fantastic political conflicts within this so-called apolitical movement of the students. The way it closed, the whole thing finished, was a fantastic contrast whether there was going to be a demonstration of anger and winning against the government, or a demonstration of mourning which was going to be silent and quiet. And the Socialist Party won over this, which was very important in winding down this movement, and nothing has been left. Now, the yellow comrades, I'm sure, did not agree with this character, but how did they fight it? Did they lead any minority in there opposing this kind of closing down of this movement? I think this is a concrete example of what I've been saying. So, the need in this period is to build organizations who have the theory and the intervention to be ready when the opportunities arise to build revolutionary parties. And I think the Trotskyists Lute Ouvrier are not prepared to do that when the time comes.
Gareth Griffin from the SWP, followed by Herman from Holland. I'm only reading what I've been given.
I want to take up where Brian McLaughlin left off, because the practice is refusal. It's very interesting that François has not taken up these questions of Eastern Europe. The assumption somehow that workers, when they go to work, don't actually think about big political issues. All they think about is what's going on in the workplace is really insulting their intelligence. So you think this in other ways as well. Not only that, but the question, say, the point that François raised about the way in which Stalinism has created an enormous gap between revolutionaries and the working class. Is it not the case that those kinds of ideas, the ideas of Stalinism, particularly in France or in Britain, the influence of social democratic ideas, do not they enter into the questions of people's preparedness to fight, how they fight, who they look to, who they trust in the trade union movement? And all those things we require theory for, because we don't actually indulge in theory as a kind of game. And the whole point is we take up those kinds of issues precisely because we want to have an accurate picture of the state of working class consciousness between the different sections of the working class in order to know how to intervene. You see, really, what it comes down to, strikes me, what Foster had to say. He said, on the one hand, we're over-optimistic in the 70s, now we're too pessimistic. The truth is then, for them, apparently there seems to be a steady motion that, on the one hand, there is this trade union bureaucracy, on the other hand, the workers. Now, of course, we're saying the bureaucracy is weakening. Now, I find that very difficult to understand. Most of us have been through the experience, for example, of the print workers' strike. Now, the question was not that print workers weren't willing to strike. The question was certainly about the influence of bureaucrats on that, at all kinds of levels. Not simply in the fact of dealing with dubbings, but equally the ideas of the bureaucracy in terms of public opinion, in terms of looking to kill us. Now, is it not the case, therefore, that you can't simply say the bureaucracy is weakening? Even in France, where the idea is, and it is certainly true, that the major trade unions have weakened their forces, it is still the case that the trade union, that those bureaucratic ideas dominate. If it were the case that people were leaving the trade unions because they were moving to the left, then François would have some point to what he's saying. But is it the case that workers are moving left? I don't think so. We can see that in terms of the growth of the vote for the National Front. We can see it in terms of the decline of the Communist Party vote. A whole number of factors tell us actually what's happening. Now, the point is to come down to a kind of version of something that we've had from Trotsky for a long time. And that is really, on the one hand, you've got this thin layer of bureaucracy, and underneath what you've got is the mass of the workers, not quite straining at the leash, but not far off it. And really, therefore, all revolutions have to do is to be there, present ideas, and somehow, magically, they will come to it. And this is really what it comes down to, in all these pleas for us to go on to factories to put out factory bulletins. That's the long and the short of it. And it may sound incredibly revolutionary. If you think about it, the question, say, of the road workers' strike in France, very, very interesting. Roger explained that everyone knew that LO led it. Now, okay, let's assume for one moment that is true. I don't actually believe it, but let's assume it's true. What did people then take that to mean? They took it to mean, in effect, that you could be a good militant, but politics was something you didn't really need to worry about. Because in practice, if you weren't prepared to be open and clear about your political orientation, what the hell did that matter in terms of building anything? That was actually the truth of it. So, okay, Dan Ribisi may have been an excellent militant. The truth is, when he was actually interviewed in the press, he hedged on the question of whether he was a revolutionary militant. Now, that actually means he's not prepared to be open and honest about the need for revolutionary politics that people take up. In other words, all they get is a non-political, syndicalist view of actually what needs to be done. Let's take the question of elections as well. I will know. Let's just take the question of elections. Very important because it sounds incredibly radical. That in practice you need to be putting out candidates that really work as finished with both the Labour Party and the Tory Party. Now, is that in fact the case? Because actually, along with the bulletin, the workers' platform, don't actually say abstain. What they say is, however you vote, then doesn't matter, the struggle will go on. A worker then says, well, actually, I'm going to vote Tory. So it doesn't matter, the struggle goes on tomorrow. Do you not think the question, the kinds of ideas people have about which way they're going to vote actually is an indication of whether they're prepared to struggle or not? Is it the case that Tory workers and Labour voting workers are actually going to have the same attitude towards the trade unions, towards struggle? Clearly not. In other words, what appears to be an incredible, radical slogan actually turns out to be a total abstention from those kinds of arguments. Therefore, actually, what the LO message comes down to is really what we have in terms of revolutionists is a kind of training manual. The training manual says that what you do is you go out and you put out your factory bulletin, but when it comes to politics, that is actually something you leave to one side. And comrades, that's actually not a serious way of intervening. The question certainly is intervention, where people are struggling, where we can. The question is the quality of that intervention around the politics. And that, comrades, is what LO is not doing.
First, I want to apologize for bad quality of my English. It's really a short question. The Socialist Workers' Party has called at the last election for a vote for the Labour Party. Well, that would have meant a vote for Sharon Atkin if she would not have been dumped by the National Labour Party executive. But in practice, it also meant a vote for Jack Cunningham of Friends of Sellafield. Can you call that a class vote? That's the question.
Sorry, can I say Chris Harmer? Chris Banbury from the SWP.
Okay, Colin, I want to start by saying, in France, is it just a question we're restricted to the issues at day-to-day level of the factory? There are a number of issues. I'll give you one issue. In Marseille recently, something like 15,000 members of Front National marched through the city. The rest of the left didn't do anything to oppose the march. The reformers called the march 3 weeks later. Arab youth in Marseille independently took action to try and stop the infractions coming into those areas. Now, I don't expect Lute Ouvrier to serve as dollars to go and do battle with fascists. I do expect them to have an orientation in building with the Communist Party and the rest of the far left, a movement to raise the issues of stopping the fascists. When it comes to this country, is it just a question in the workplace that we, as the SWP, are just confronted or ducking the issues, or just confronting the issues of toilet paper and all the rest of it? There's a number of other issues that come up. I'll give an issue which I think you have to look very, very hard for in Lute Ouvrier to find out anything about, and that's the question of gay liberation. I tell you, gay liberation of the SWP is not just a case of real 100% for lesbian gay liberation. And the current climate in Britain is something we fight on and fight on hard. Take the question of Haringey. In North London and Haringey, when there's a positive images that move from the right-wing backlash against the takeoff, where we see demonstrations in right-wing areas, working class embers taking part in those beginning demonstrations, we see it as our duty to be on the streets, opposing the bigots and arguing with the reformists and arguing with the Labour Party to actually take part in those actions. It's to our credit when it comes to the Gay Pride March. We attend there. We're out in force. We're actually arguing in every workplace where we can, every worker. The question of gay liberation is an issue for us. We can't be divided. The tragedy, of course, is none of this sort of Labour Party are missing the Gay Pride demonstration. Just one campaign banner for the Labour Party. No CLPs, no ward parties. The tragedy is over the West and the left as well. We take a bit of silence, like on the question. I'll just end by saying this. Inside the workplace, the present period, the idea that the SWP is missing out. I'll tell you the question and issues that dominate. Question of AIDS, for instance. In every union branch, every workplace, you have to take a position. The question of racism. The questions that are thrown up again and again and again. I'll just end by saying this. I find it absolutely fantastic, the idea that the SWP is sitting out in any disputes. Take the question of the telecom dispute. We were the only people in Britain actually on those picky lines. We weren't just fly-by-nights, we didn't just disappear. Our companies were victimised as a result of our activity in that thing. Our companies were victimised. In the mines, is it a question of fly-by-night operation? Did we just go into the mines and disappear after the strikes over? Look at the back page of the Socialist Worker, look at the strikes in Yorkshire, look at the names of our militants actually playing a role in that, and then also look at their activities. Not just a question of toilet paper those miners are raising. When it comes to the question of age, when it comes to the question of backlash, our comrades in Yorkshire went out as a result of that and so badly saying, let's engage support the minors. That's the question of bringing politics into the workplace. It's the unity of economics and politics. No matter if these people supported us in the strike, we should have paid 101. But it came to Broadwater Farm. What did we do? We ensured Broadwater Farm, the youth from Broadwater Farm went to the pitch in Yorkshire. The idea of bringing the labour issue into the workplace, bringing unity of economics and politics.
Contribution from the floor is that both speakers will now sum up for, they'll have 10 minutes each to sum up. Francois will sum up first.
Okay, comrades, there has been quite a flood of quotations out of context and just distorted and a lot of things. I don't want to go into that game, but I want to, it's a bit amazing from comrades who put such an emphasis on the importance of theory that they should use such awkward arguments. Anyway, there was one direct question which was put to me by a comrade from the gentleman, I think, about what we think about Eastern Europe. Now, comrades, is it the case that this comrade doesn't read either French or English? Is it the case that he doesn't know that there's laws and laws of publication? That question, which has, goes back from the late 50s. So you've got, like 810, 1,000 pages of articles on that question. I'll leave it with him.
Comrades, come on, sum up, you can answer or not answer anything you want. Carry on, for the benefit of the rest of the comrades, which I'm not going to ask to read all that literature that he wants, apparently he needs that. I would just say that we consider Eastern Europe countries, apart from the USSR, as being bourgeois states, and quite openly so. One comrade criticized us at the beginning of the discussion for considering the question of USSR as secondary compared to the task of building the party. And he quotes as evidence the fact that this question has dominated the left for a large number of years. Well, the unfortunate thing is that that doesn't prove at all the importance of the question as regards our task. That proves that the only problem that revolutionary militants could see was precisely that question, on which they had no way to put the conclusions that they had to the test, and which didn't bring any consequence at all in their actual activity. Whereas we had a lot of events going around in the world, but apparently these, much of the left was not concerned about these events, and for very good reasons that their influence was so small that they had no way of influencing these events. Now, I want to come back on the question of discussion on theoretical issues for that reason. I think it's useful and necessary to discuss theoretical issues, but discussing them in isolation from their practical consequences in terms of party building is not only impossible, it is meaningless and it is very misleading. After all, revolutionary militants, as Marxists, we are all the proclaimers of the future world. We need the theory in order to make sure that our bricks are going to stick together, don't we? And not for the sake of filling empty libraries. But it's true for the downturn theory of which I spoke a bit before. It's also true for a whole number of issues which, according to the SWP, are of paramount importance.
such as the relevance of Trotskyism today or the analysis of the past nature of Russia. Yes, comrades, it's useful, it is necessary to discuss these questions. And although we did that at length with the INS in the early 70s, we are quite prepared to go through this debate again. The SWP considers the state as a capitalist state of a particular brand, because the working class has been deprived of political power. We consider the USSR as a degenerated worker state, because it was built by the victorious revolution, pro-Italian revolution in 1917, and has never been destroyed since then. We have opposite views on this question, and we could confront our ideas truthfully, if only for the benefit of the younger comrades of both our organizations, who didn't have the chance to watch the debate that took place in the early 70s. But for this debate to be truthful, it has to be aimed at showing the consequences of our respective analysis in terms of the task we are faced with. Up to now, none of the many brands of state capitalists, which are just as numerous as the various brands of Trotskyists, have in any way proved that their analysis made them more effective in relation to the real world, that is, in relation to the task of building the revolutionary party and to bringing revolutionary politics back into the working class. Now, today's debate could be the starting point of such a real debate between our organizations. Not one of those traditional academical debates, which time and again have proved to be so sterile in the revolutionary movement, but a debate between Marxists who aim at changing the world, between militants who see their activity primarily in relation to the class struggle, between revolutionaries who are eager to use any idea, any experience, any criticism which may help them to be more effective in carrying out their task. This is a proposal that we have already made to the SWP and that we still make to them. But in order to make this debate concrete, the organizations involved have to know about what they're talking about. And that's one of the problems we have run against in the case of the railroad strike, for instance. It's quite significant that two comrades who were over in France, Maureen Watson and Gareth Jenkins, who were over in France during that strike, didn't even consider 1 minute, apparently, the idea of getting into contact with the knowing that our members were very much involved, and trying to find out what the bloody hell we were doing in that strike. I can tell you, at that time I popped back and forth between Britain and England, and that every night you could attend to meetings involving our militants, in which the policy of the organization was being decided and discussed and argued about. And I would think that if those comrades had even had any interest at all in the way in which another organization was trying to face and to solve problems, then they would have asked to come and to attend to this discussion. They were quite open, they would have been quite open to other militants coming to understand what was going on. And that maybe would have allowed them to bring not only sterile criticism, but criticism that can help us. And that's the whole point, comrades. A discussion between organizations is meant not to settle accounts, not to say, well, I have 2 points, they have 3 points, let's carry on. That's not our problem at all. Discussions are meant to allow organizations to benefit from the experience of each other. Otherwise, what's the point? Thank you very much.
The SWP, Alex Callinicos.
Okay, thanks. Well, I just want to say something briefly first about the question of building internationally. and the idea which the Yellow Comrades place a great deal of emphasis on, which is sharing experience through the exchange of militants between different organisations. Now, quite simply, I don't want to spend much time on it, you can't talk about any useful exchange of experience between different revolutionary organisations unless one has any criterion of the political relevance of that experience. What kind of experience of building are we talking about? What kind of organisation is the group in question trying to build on the basis of what kind of politics? The question of politics is absolutely fundamental because it's the politics that gives the point to a particular way of building. And that means that, frankly, there's some exchanges of experience, let alone militants that we're interested in, there are others that we're not. We're not interested, for example, in exchange of militants with one of the largest Trotskyist organisations in Latin America, the Morenoites in Argentina, with whom Elo did have an exchange, an organisation with a semi-Stalinist internal regime, and whose politics makes enormous concessions to bourgeois nationalism in Argentina. We're certainly not in favour of the exchange of militants with the right-wing sect in this country, which goes under the name of the Revolutionary Communist Party, yet the Comrades of Elo are prepared to have an exchange with them. In other words, we're not in favour of exchange with any organisation. We're in favour of seeking, in the first place, to clarify ideas and to identify a real common ground based upon shared ideas which can provide the basis for various kinds of cooperation. Actually, the example of the comrades from OSEC, the Socialist Revolution Group in Greece, is one example of how that kind of cooperation can develop, because what's actually happened over the past few years is that a massive convergence in both theoretical conceptions and methods of building has developed between us and the comrades of OSEC, and because of that, for example, comrades like Panos at present at Marxism 87, and there's quite explosive exchange of ideas going on, experience going on. Without the shared politics, the exchange of experience has no meaning. So let's move to the theoretical questions. See, why is it that we go on about Eastern Europe? Why is it that we place such enormous emphasis on the correct understanding of the state capitalist countries? The reason why it's crucial is because without the right theory, without the right analysis of the Eastern Bloc, you will not be able to preserve Marxism as a living tradition. I emphasize living tradition. In other words, a body of theory and practice that can relate to the world as it develops and changes. To have a theory which says, as Trotskoy just said, that the state which was created by the Soviets and the Bolsheviks as a mass party in 1917, that state has never been destroyed, is to completely cut yourself off from the world in which we have lived for the past 60 years. It's to ignore the counter-revolution that destroyed any remnants of workers' power in Russia, the counter-revolution that killed millions of peasants and drove them off the land, the counter-revolution that wiped out the old Bolsheviks of whatever political tendency they may have represented, and which created instead a regime based upon the systematic exploitation and oppression of the Russian working class. If you are incapable of noticing so massive a change as the Stalinist counter-revolution in Russia, then you are not going to be able to relate to the world in which you live. Instead, you're going to have to transform theory into a set of dogmas that you're, in some respects, not some respects, which you're frightened of looking at, which you're frightened of examining critically, which you're frightened of trying to apply to the world, in case it sets at risk your existing orthodoxies. The only way to preserve Marxism as a living tradition, capable of relating to the world today, is to have an analysis of the Eastern Bloc, which preserves the fundamental principles of revolutionary Marxism, the self-emancipation of the working class, only workers can make a workers' state, but at the same time relates to the way in which things have developed in Russia. Now, Trotskoy says the only fundamental difference is on building, on how we build revolutionary organisations. And the way in which he tried to make that out was by spending a lot of time being rather rude about what he called the downturn theory. Now, I should say, we didn't invent the idea of upturns and downturns. Read Trotsky. Read many of Trotsky's best writings are precisely about shifts in the level of class struggle. One of the fundamental differences that separates the revolutionary Marxist tradition, the tradition of Lenin and the Bolsheviks and Trotsky and so on, is the capacity is understanding that the class struggle isn't some sort of continuous process that never changes, but rather a process that goes through abrupt qualitative changes, rises and falls at the level of class struggle, which actually, as a result of those rises and falls, actually changes the tasks of the revolutionaries, the possibilities of building revolutionary organisations and the like. I mean, to say that there's really very little difference between the situation of the early 1970s and the situation today is really, again, to blind yourself to reality. A situation where de Gaulle was forced to flee to the French generals in France to get their support against the general strike in France, a situation in which a Tory government in Britain was brought down by a miners' strike, a situation in which the soldiers and workers marched under revolutionary banners in the streets of Portugal. I don't need to say more than that. A situation like that is fundamentally different from one, such as the present, where Francois may not have noticed it, but we've noticed the serious defeats that workers have suffered. The miners' strike was a terrible defeat, not just for the miners, but the whole working class in Britain, and to some degree a defeat for the international working class. If you don't face realities like that, then you're not going to be able to relate. Now, the question of intervention. See, I mean, I ultimately get rather angry at the idea that we're really a bunch of academics who are just interested in reading and writing books and who don't intervene in what's happening outside us. Intervention is fundamental for revolutionaries. Revolutionaries always intervene. The difference lies in the form that the intervention takes. The form of intervention changes depending upon the particular situation. I mean, I don't have time to go into it, but we intervened massively as an organisation in the miners' strike. We threw all our resources into the miners' strike, into building solidarity with the miners' strike, in trying to influence its course, in arguing in immense detail the way to take the strike forward, and so on. We did everything we could, subjectively as an organisation, to influence the course of the miners' strike. We failed because of our weakness. We didn't fail from any lack of effort on our own part. Since the defeat of the miners' strike, have we simply sat around and read books? On the contrary, what we've done is to intervene massively as an organisation in the crisis going on in the labour movement as a result of the defeat that took place, to intervene in the debates inside the Labour Party, the attacks on the militants, and so on and so forth. It's really such an absurd idea to say that we don't intervene, that it almost doesn't bear argument. I don't really have time to say much on the question of elections. Frankly, Francois, the question of candidates is an irrelevancy. You stand at however many candidates you like. The question comes, what do you do in France in the second ballot, the ballot when the revolutionary candidates have been eliminated, and it's simply the reformist parties versus the open bourgeois parties? What vote do you call for then? What do you do in Britain in the constituencies where you don't stand candidates? Do you say it doesn't matter which way you vote, or do you take a stand on which party you want to see winning? As to the idea that we invented a theory that the vote for the Labour Party is a class vote, for God's sake, Lenin at the Second Congress of the Comintern defined the approach by revolutionaries towards reformist parties in election. Not giving allusions to reformism, not coattailing reformism, but supporting the reformists like the rope supports the hanged man. It was in terms of arguing for a revolutionary strategy towards the Labour Party, which we carried on, that formulation came out. Because the Labour Party was a bourgeois workers' party, we had at the same time to be ruthlessly critical of the policies of the Labour Party, at the same time, because of its basis in the mass organisations of the working class, and the hold that then gives on militants, we have to argue for a vote later, both as a demonstration of class solidarity and as a way of trying to demonstrate in practice, through the election of reformist governments, to demonstrate that reformism doesn't deliver the goods of workers. You may think that's a wrong theory, Francois. It's not ours. It's Lenin and Trotsky's. So it seems to be you who are re-examining the Marxist tradition and rejecting crucial aspects of it, not us. The final point I want to make is, how best do we prepare for the upturn that will develop, not simply in Britain, but internationally? What's the best way of preparing for that upturn? The best way of preparing is this. We know that when workers move into struggle, we know because, for example, of experiences of the miners' strikes, when workers move into struggle, their ideas change. They're driven into conflict with their old ways of thinking. They're forced to re-examine all sorts of ideas that they previously accepted. They become open to new, strange ideas. I agree absolutely with the comments who said that the LO's approach towards workers is fantastically patronising. The idea that workers aren't interested in Marxist theory, the idea that workers aren't interested in history, science, politics, philosophy, a whole range of things, is fantastically patronising towards the working class. When workers move in a large scale, they become much more open to new ideas than they normally are. The key test of a revolutionary organisation is building, not in the few, of course build where you can, build in the workplaces where you are. You're going to be in the nature of things, given the size of our organisations, only in very, very few places. The key thing is building an organisation of revolutionary militants grounded in a broad understanding of the Marxist tradition that can relate to any group of workers when they really move on a large scale. And through relating to those workers, can win them to Marxist ideas and begin to lay the basis of a mass revolutionary party that will lead workers to power.
Comrades, can you stay where you are just 1 second? There's one maximum. Any SWP comrade